Okay, hello everybody. This is almost the ending of memory. Up until now, we've discussed the definition of memory. We've discussed the different models that describe how the human memory system works. We went through building memories, in other words, encoding. We discussed the explicit, implicit memories, automatic, effortful processing, etc. Then we went into storage. That we began discussing the capacity and the definition of long-term memory. And the different brain areas that are involved in memory processing, storage. We spoke about long-term potentiation. So when we spoke about storage, we were talking about more the neuroscientific or the cognitive neuroscientific study of memory. Then in our last classes, we were talking about retrieval, how we can best aid our retrieval of memory. And now to end this last module, we'll discuss, explain why we forget, the different errors that exist when we construct memories, and the strategies on how to improve memory. But before we move on, I want to remind everybody that this is in no way a substitution for your readings. It is important that you review your reading notes. And if you haven't done your reading notes, then please do them now, and so that you can have a review of the text reading as well in detail. Remember, not all concepts will be discussed. This is more as either in the screencast or in class. It's important that you complement all the note taking from class, from these screencasts, and overlap and find the overlap between these and what is not overlapping between these sort of resources and the textbook. Well, we normally associate forgetting with something negative. The capacity of forgetting is actually positive. If we consider, all the information that is useless or out of date can actually be a helpful or an adaptive trait. So your textbook goes over these cases about, I believe, a Russian memory whiz that I believe wouldn't go by his full name, but by initial. I forget the initial right now. Or a more modern case, Jill Price, I believe her name is, who has what we saw in the videos in class, superior autobiographical memory, and how both of these individuals with different case of these super memories, they lived basically tormented or with the inability to think I forget which one of these two cases were, but one of them just had the inability to think abstractly. It felt constantly overwhelmed. It felt sort of that he wanted to focus on important memories or important learning, and yet these out of date and irrelevant information kept intruding or interfering in the process of trying to retrieve these memories. So it was actually these conditions, while we might think of them as gifted, some like these cases, these people were not happy with having this ability to remember every single thing, every single day, and when and how everything happened in their lives. So your textbook adds this quote on Williams-James, which I don't need to read to you, but that can remind you that forgetting is not always negative and that can actually be adaptive and helpful. But as with all extremes, forgetting can be, in fact, a condition that can be frustrating, especially for people that suffer from amnesia. Now, remember, please write these down. Amnesia its definition is quite simple, is the loss of memory or the inability to retrieve a particular event in our lives due to brain damage, disease, or it could also, the difference between damage and disease is one is an injury, the other a disease that affects a part of the brain or different areas of the brain. Or it can also be amnesia can be caused by psychological trauma as well. There are two types of amnesia. Please remember them. It's difficult, they're tricky, but work with these portions of the word, I believe prefixes, anterograde and retrograde. Anterograde is somebody who lives in the past. The way I remember it is that antero comes before retro. I have this mnemonic. I've repeated it so many times. So antero goes before retro. So antero are people that live in the past, people that have the inability to form new memories. However, people with anterograde, and this I have to add the relationship here, another important thing, the relationship between amnesia and the dual track mind, or our ability or our mind's dual processing approach to information all around us. And it is that people with anterograde amnesia, while they can't form new memories, they live in the past, they are able to learn new skills, meaning they are able to form procedural memories. And they also, if classically conditioned to a particular stimulus in the environment, they can become classically conditioned. Again, they can process and form implicit memories. In the case in your textbook is described how I believe this patient who the doctor would forget the name of the doctor, no matter for how long they knew each other, for I think 20, 30 years or more, yet the patient became conditioned because the doctor, in testing, I believe this, whether they could become classically conditioned or not, I think had a tack once in the hand or several times in the hand. So the patient, for some reason, his or her impulse was to remove their hand when shaking the doctor's hand, but yet they couldn't remember the name. Again, they were unable to form a new explicit memory that had to do with the name of the doctor. And they lived in the past. And there's this event also about showing in the mirror that they weren't 20 years old or an age like that, and then being shocked by the realization that they were 70 because the age in the mirror, what they were seeing themselves physically did not correspond to how old they thought they were. But then they moved on to a different thought and they would forget about it. Again, anterograde amnesia, an ability to form new memories. Retrograde amnesia, I associate it more with the telenovela or the soap opera type of amnesia. They're able to sort of form new memories, but they live in the present. And, and in the future, they forget completely who they are, where they come from. And this is more used in the media. And as I said, in soap operas, especially where this case of somebody who just, because of psychological trauma, something terrible happened to them, they just forget who they are and they begin a new life. Now, while it might seem that I may be mocking this condition, which is not my intention, I'm just saying it's more common in these sort of over-the-top stories that I've seen. And it is a lesser common, it's not as often as anterograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is a condition that is real. Okay, let's jump right in. So why do we forget? Well, as you can see, this slide explains how forgetting can occur at any stage of the formation of memory, or as we learn something new. And it could be either because of encoding failure, storage decay, retrieval failure, and therefore let's begin with encoding failure. Encoding failure might be too obvious, so it's pretty simple. So it might be too simple to be true. But our forgetting or failing to encode information is a reason for forgetting, and it's basically because the information was never there. We might perceive that we had it in our short-term and then long-term memory, but it never entered either. Meaning it lacked effortful processing. So basically, if we look at the graph we have here, information went into our sensory memory, but we did not pay attention to it. So therefore, it never entered our long-term memory. And this is encoding failure. I believe one of the videos in the Launchpad provides you with an opportunity to this concept of failing to encode with a penny. We have seen many pennies in our life. They have entered our sensory memory many times. However, I don't think many of us, I personally cannot, reproduce on a drawing with detail the information. I don't even know what's on the back of a penny. So I'm sure we all vary to what degree we can retrieve from memory, but I certainly have never encoded this information, while I would think perhaps that I did because of the amount of times I've been exposed to this stimulus. Another example, I believe, with this failing to encode is think about how many times we've seen the flag of the United States. I'm sure many times for many years. Yet if we were to ask, what is the first color on top of the flag? Now, that particular memory, many of us have never encoded. I'm sure, if not all of us. This is, again, failing to encode information into sensory memory, but that attention that brings sensory memory to short-term memory never happened, or we never exercised it for it to happen. Okay, the next one. Storage decay is our next reason that explains why we forget. Storage decay refers to the natural and yet physiological reason as to why memories simply fade after storage. Some of them do. And we need to associate the concept or this principle of memory loss to, again, Hermann Ebbinghaus. Let's retrieve him from memory for a minute. He gave us the retention curve, and he also gave us the sort of giving his forgetting curve. And please look at it more in detail in your textbook. Don't just go by what I tell you here. But in a nutshell, Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve explains how, and he would test this with the same thing we did in class about trying to remember these nonsense syllables, is that he realized that the day after or right after these trials of trying to measure how much he retained when he did these trials of memorizing these nonsense syllables, and he realized that didn't actually remember much. People didn't remember much information, even the day after, I believe, after memorizing these syllables. So the information I'm trying to say is that information, or what he was trying to, or what he concluded is that forgetting, this natural memory decay, occurs rapidly and forcefully right after when it started to be measured, the memory loss. However, the little information that stayed in our memory remained in long-term memory for a long time. I meant to say stored for a long time. And this might make more sense if you pay attention to the studies they did with people learning Spanish in high school, and how people, after 3 years of not studying Spanish, realize that they have forgotten a lot of the vocabulary terms. So, as a Spanish teacher, I must say, that's why you have to continue studying Spanish in college. Anyway, so, sorry, I digressed. So, people who hadn't continued their world languages studies or Spanish studies, then they realized that they had forgotten a lot. Yet, the information that they did remember, that they were able to retrieve, I think, even 5 or 20 years after. So again, this is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, and please look at the graph carefully and analyze it so you can process it semantically and you can encode it there into long-term memory. And it's closely associated with the concept of storage decay. And then finally, we've reached the third reason for forgetting, and that would be retrieval failure. Now, retrieval failure is sort of the general concept of forgetting. But retrieval failure, we've stored this memory in long-term. We've stored this memory, in long-term memory. Sorry, I'm a little exhausted here, and so memories have gotten all the way to long-term memory, right? They've gone through all this encoding and attention, but then we are unable to retrieve. So there are several concepts that we need to associate with this failure to retrieval reason for forgetting. One of them is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And we've all gone through that we try to remember the name of somebody, but that person is in another context perhaps, and we would like a retrieval cue. Oh, if I could only knew the first letter of that word. When people are trying to encourage us to remember something, but we tell them, don't tell me, I want to remember. Well, associate that with the retrieval for failure, and you're asking for a cue, yet you're not asking for the entire question, because then it is given to you and you're not able to retrieve it, right? I don't know why we become so caught up in this, but we sort of seem to be fixed on trying to demonstrate that we can retrieve. Anyway, another reason why we retrieve to fail is because interference. And when in memory we refer to interference, that means that old information collides with new information, and there seems to be here a conflict between the two, causing us to be unable to retrieve. Okay, this is tricky. So we have two types of interference. We have proactive interference and retroactive interference. Please focus on the fact that one is forward acting and the other one is backward acting. because this refers to whether it's pro, forward, retro, backward, refers to the interference. So if the interference goes forward, that means that this is old information interrupting or disrupting the retrieval of new information. And retroactive or retroactive is going backwards, right? So the only way we can explain that is if the interference is going backwards, that means that new information is interfering with our ability to recall prior learned information. The other thing is that usually they are related. So let's say languages. Somebody who's studying two languages but learned one language first. I can give you my example. I learned, I sort of learned both at the same time, but my native tongue, I consider it Spanish. So when I came back here to the United States to live, now sometimes I go through this. I know the word in Spanish, but I can't retrieve it. But I can't sort of remember the term in English. And I have encoded the term, but I just can only remember it in Spanish. So if I learn Spanish first, I consider it my native tongue, and I am unable to say that same term in English. So perhaps the fact that I know it in Spanish is interfering with my ability to learn it in English, a language I learned afterwards. So that would be proactive interference because I learned Spanish first. And sometimes I experience the complete opposite. Sometimes, in the more years I live here, I have the inability to recall a term in Spanish that I definitely have stored in long-term memory. Yet because I know the term in English, that particular piece of information is interfering or disrupting my ability to remember something I learned prior, and that would be retroactive interference. Now, please have your notes. This reminds me also of the von Riestorff effect. Please remember to have that in your notes because your textbook doesn't explain it. Another one I want to add is this concept of positive, excuse my handwriting, I'm not used to writing, positive transfer. And positive transfer refers to, or reminds us that old and new information do not always collide. Sometimes it's actually a positive phenomenon. So again, positive transfer refers to this idea that old and new learning do not always have to compete with each other, of course. Positive transfer occurs when previously learned information facilitates our learning of new information. I'll repeat that. Previously learned information facilitates the learning of new information. For instance, I tend to notice that most of my not all of them, but I would say 80% of my strongest students have a familiarity or have studied in the past Latin. And Latin has allowed them, at least most students have studied Latin before, their ability to grasp the grammar, which I believe is very similar. I never studied Latin. But I believe that knowledge of grammar can transfer positively, can cause positive transfer to occur, and therefore make the learning of Spanish much easier. And I believe with all the other Romance language that has to be the case as well. Oh, very important. How to, based on this concept of proactive and retroactive interference, I want to focus a little bit on retroactive, as your text does. And they say that it's strongly recommended to avoid retroactive interference. Let's say you have a test the following day, right? To review or learn any new information 1 hour prior to sleep. 1 hour prior to sleep, because it's not that you're falling asleep yet you are not allowing much opportunity for retroactive interference to occur. To avoid retroactive interference, it's suggested in your textbook, and as research indicates, that to relearn it 1 hour before. Therefore, they're not allowing, again, an opportunity for retroactive interference for future events to occur that evening that would interfere with your ability to learn or to disrupt the memory of that information you need to know for the exam the following day. Then we also have motivated forgetting. And this has to do simply with the fact that we tend to, when we replay these memories, if it's about a situation that causes us embarrassment, or that is not consistent to our self-concept, or that we can consider anxious provoking, we will modify it. And David Myers explains this perfectly with the example of cookie. So I'm going to encourage you to look at that example. And it's not that we completely forget an event, but we might embellish it, or we might mitigate its magnitude because it is not consistent with ourself, and we do this again out of consciousness, because otherwise it would be plain and simple manipulation or lying. So seems to that we are wired to sort of recall memories, and more consistently with whether either how we see us, plain and simple, or whether how we see us now today, as opposed to how we saw ourselves, or as opposed to how we defined ourselves 30 years ago. And they also go in your text into this discussion about how people were unable to remember accurately their stance on different issues in politics, or their attitudes towards a variety of topics when they were in the ninth grade. That actually they did as good as they would do guessing out of the blue. So again, because they were recalling their attitudes at that time, it is as if they asked me to recall what were my attitudes towards different politics, religion, and everything when I was in the ninth grade. Apparently, I will have a strong tendency, as did all the other subjects in this research, to make my attitudes much more consistent with how I feel now, as opposed to how they truly were. And they did this study by asking people when they were in the ninth grade, and then asking them again 30 years later. That's what we call a longitudinal study, when you are measuring the same subjects but in different periods of time. So just keep that in mind. Oh, one more thing. This is tied into the concept of, it's a Freudian term called repression. We use the term repression a lot. And your textbook even explains how actually it's a very popular concept. We believe in this idea that traumatic events, we repress them, and we sort of expel them from our memory to protect our self-concept. And this was a defense mechanism, remember that, proposed by Freud. And he said that basically our memories are self-censoring, and they will protect our self-concepts. They will protect how we see ourselves. In order to do this, to protect ourselves, and in order to minimize anxiety, we may block it from consciousness. Now, this is not exactly the same as motivated forgetting. Remember that I told you that it's not that we completely forget the event, is that we may embellish it or change it. No, with Freud, it was basically we expel it from our consciousness, any type of painful memories, anything that we could consider a threat to how we see ourselves. And so, sort of in Freud's view, this motivated forgetting submerges memories but leaves them available, right, later for retrieval under the right conditions. And of course, for him, the right conditions were given in therapy. And he analyzed dreams, and he analyzed through free association. And he would say that these repressed memories, events in our lives, would again surface. We spoke a little about that during the approaches. But important to remember that this idea of repression, while popular, scientifically has been measured and repression does not occur, if not at all, does not occur very often. In fact, researchers agree, the consensus is that it occurs rarely, that we actually, and this is tied into the concept of flashbulb memories and this activation of our fight or flight system that increases stress hormones, we talked about that already, that we actually have very, very vivid recollections. I was watching again, like many other people, I was watching the Kavanaugh hearings, and this woman, how she had some reported to have lapses within her memory. However, she did say, I am 100% sure of this and that, which by the way, think it was a waste of time for her, very unfortunately. But without getting too political, so she did remember what she did remember. She had a very vivid recollection. Now, Freud would have said, oh, this is too threatening to my self-concept. I can't believe I was treated this way. This is too scary for me, cause of too much anxiety. Therefore, she would have, the victim of this assault, or alleged victim of this assault, would have repressed this event. And we've seen that today this was not the case. In fact, she claims to be 100% sure that this happened. Oh, an example of the difference between motivated forgetting and repression, Freud's defense mechanism, is that study that they talk about in your textbook about people participating in the study, in which under a certain condition they were told about the importance of toothbrushing, and in the other conditions they did not. Well, the people whom they informed about the importance and the benefits of toothbrushing then reported actually that they found out that they reported significantly that they toothbrushed significantly more frequently than the group that hadn't been informed about the benefits of toothbrushing. So again, it's not that they forgot that they were, sort of recreating completely a memory from scratch. Is that they embellished it. They increased the frequency with which they brush their teeth. Then finally, going with this question in your textbook about explain how misinformation, imagination, and source amnesia influence our memory construction, and describe how we decide whether a memory is real or false. It's very important to understand. Now, here we're going to talk about Elizabeth Loftus. I'm telling you right now, this is the person important in this part. How memory construction errors have to do, or misinformation effect has to do with false memory. Your textbook explains this very well. But just as a summary, we have to remember that memories are not stored as exact copies, and that we certainly do not retrieve them as such. I remember this thought by thinking that we build our memories. It's not that we have them stored exactly as we remember them and then just pull them out from our memory. In fact, we build a replica, never as good as the original event, right? When we were exposed to whatever created, or whatever time created this memory, we construct them. This idea of reconsolidation. So remember, reconsolidation is this process through which we replay a memory, in which we replace the original with a slightly modified version that we're basically building almost from scratch, in which we're combining stored information, but also as we speak with other people, we're including this information too. Or if someone asks us a question in a different way, a misleading question or a leading question, that is going to very likely interfere and not make that memory that we are replaying exactly the same as the last time we played it, or as the original memory when it was formed. So in many experiments, this has been tested many times, people have, for instance, witnessed an event, right, and received misleading information. This is Elizabeth Loftus' study, by the way, and then taken a memory case, and then the repeated result indicated that this misleading information actually resulted in what the textbook defines as the misinformation effect, which means that we, after being exposed to subtle misinformation, we may misremember, or we may in fact even create false memories. So asking leading questions can plant false memories. As people, as we tend to recount an experience, for example, think about it. When we talk about something that happened a while ago, we actually fill in many parts of the memory gaps with inferences. Oh yeah, this could have been this, and we seem to do this automatically. Well, actually, misinformation effect, it does occur automatically. If not, it would be a plain lie, right? So we seem to automatically sort of fill in the gaps, and then our vivid retellings also, we unconsciously sort of amp it up and try to make it more exciting. We have these vivid retellings, and that also can implant false memories during this reconsolidation process. Remember, it's different from consolidation. So, and in fact, this is a very interesting one, the repeatedly imagining fake actions, or, as sometimes we may daydream, or sometimes we may think that things happened and we replay them in our memory, can also, by ourselves, we can implant ourselves through the repeated imagination, or imagining this, we can create a false memory. And I know it may sound not plausible, but this actually is the case, at least indicated by research. Very important to understand Elizabeth Loftus, again, the pioneer in the misinformation effect. She has a study that is explained in her textbook, and the effect of the misinformation effect, she measured it with misleading questions. So she has people in two conditions. They watch the same video about two cars crashing. Now, one group, then she later asks, among other questions, so how far do you estimate the cars were going when they smashed each other? And the other one, when they hit each other. So, of course, smashed, for us, at least, the meaning of smash means really strong impact, whereas hit could be, not as severe. So, of course, people who had been misled with the leading question, with smashed, how far they were they were driving when they smashed each other. Not only did they estimate going faster than the group that was told that hit each other, but also they asked them if they remember, for instance, glass being shattered. They did that too because whereas the people in the hit condition did not, because there was no glass. But the other group that was told the smashed condition, I'm going to call them, sort of remembered more things, again, a false memory, because it was more consistent with the fact that the cars had smashed each other. So this question was misleading and led them to implant the false memory. As I said previously, imagination can impact memory. Recreating an event, a false event in our mind many times, can lead to implanting ourselves a false memory. Or if, let's say, and this has much to do with the sometimes inhumane interrogation techniques, in which people under lots of distress and sleep deprivation are asked through questions inevitably to go over a situation over and over. And this false, and I know while, again, guys, we might seem that we're not prone to this, but trust me, many people have been asked to recreate by asking these questions. Were you there at the scene of the murder? I don't know. I'm going with, these very cliche scenes of that might seem serious, but the interrogation techniques are tricky in the sense that they ask this suspect to go through the situation many times, and inevitably we begin imagining it, despite the fact that we say, no, I wasn't there. But inevitably we are very prone to, after going through it in our mind many times, even if we are sure we didn't commit a crime, we could end up with a false confession. And trust me, this occurs more often than we might want it to. I'm going to end here. Source amnesia goes along with this concept of source amnesia and misinformation effect. That both together are very powerful creators of false memories. And your textbook explains how source amnesia is actually, again, they both are automatic processes. They happen outside of our awareness. And they in your textbook, it explains how the most vulnerable part of our memories are actually remembering how, when, or where they were formed. So our memory for the source of an event, as to how it happened, when it happened, and where it happened, that's the source here. Having source amnesia is when we attribute the wrong source to an event we have experienced, or heard about, or read about, or imagined. So this is when, let's say, someone tells us some gossip, right, or a story about somebody, and we, for some reason, we either pictured that it happened for real, or we heard something in the news, our teacher perhaps tells us something in class, and we begin thinking that we saw it in the news, and in our effort to, I don't know, we just forget where this memory was formed. The most significant part is sort of this idea of imagining something so many times. Well, perhaps we saw it on TV, and we remember it as, and I'm talking about extreme cases, but these things do happen, that we read about it and we think we dreamt it, or we dreamt about it and we don't remember. That's a common one. We dreamt about it and we forgot. We sort of think that it happened for real. Now, the source of the event could be that too. The source was a dream, but we remember it as if it happened to us, meaning the event itself is real, but it just did not happen in that same context. And that's what we refer to source amnesia. Deja vu is closely related to this because, again, deja vu has to do with the familiarity of a situation. But here, areas in our temporal lobe are lagging behind or the frontal lobes are lagging behind the information that is being registered in the temporal lobes, because temporal lobes say, oh, this is familiar, I've seen this before, and our frontal lobes are going to say, yes, you remember this from this particular situation. But if the frontal lobes are lagging behind, if these two areas of the brain are not in sync, then our brain seems to sort of fill in the gaps by saying, oh, I predicted this would happen, or I've been exactly in the same situation below. And this deja vu fleeting, it's described as a fleeting sensation, disorienting. It freaks out many people, in other words, is closely related to this source amnesia concept. And your textbook explains several examples of source amnesia and deja vu, um, which is similar, not the same, but is this, again, I want to reiterate with deja vu, is this feeling that we are reliving something, but truly it's that we are familiar with aspects of it, but that part of the brain that says, oh yeah, of course you're familiar with this because you were in a situation that was very similar, or you were here yesterday, or you were here a week ago, but this is a total different thing. But since our brain is, again, that area that does this is lagging behind, is not there in sync with that temporal lobe area that is detecting familiarity, then our brain seems to fill in this gap and saying, oh yeah, you're living it again. So it seems to be the only way we can explain that eerie feeling of deja vu. Then, guys, for the purpose of time, I think I have nothing else to add to the why the reports of repressed and recovered memories, especially relating to child sex abuse, are controversial. Please read how these psychologists and people in courts need to be very aware of the best ways to have children report these, because they can be very reliable sources. But in summary, it depends on them not being exposed to leading questions, because their memories are also very malleable. So read that please very carefully. If you have any questions, let me know. So remember to define the reliability of young children's eyewitness descriptions. They talk very clearly about that. And then finally, that last page on, I can guarantee you there will be some questions on how to improve your memory based on the research findings discussed in this module. And that's all for memory, guys. If you have any questions, email me, and good luck.